If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what are your night shift horror/scary stories? Oh man, I hate recalling this story. I work night shift at a rehab facility. We have a protected gate with a camera looking down from above and one of those doorbell cameras. In the office, the camera monitor is on one wall and the doorbell monitor is on another. I was doing some paperwork and see this guy walk past, stop for a few seconds, then slowly turned around, walked back and stared up at the camera. And he kept staring. The facility is in a rough neighborhood, so I'm fairly used to folks hanging out around the gate and usually ignore it. But the way he was staring was off-putting. Like, his eyes and expression were hollow and dead, almost as if he were in deep thought about something horrible. I was pretty sure he was zonked on synthetics. I used the intercom to see if he was okay, but he just kept staring directly at the camera. We have a rule: if it's not hurt or trying to come through the fence, just let it be. No sense in engaging needlessly with somebody potentially hostile or fucking with the locals. Y'all, he stood there and stared at that camera for 2 hours. That same dead-eyed expression staring right at me. I did a round and came back to find him gone, which only creeped me out more. I work at an apple orchard. During after-season cleanup, I ran late one night, nothing new, and met something I really hope to not meet again. I was transferring some wet and rotting hay bales into the manure spreader at night with only a cheap headlamp and the brake lights of the truck I was using to illuminate the area behind me. About halfway through, I start feeling like I'm being watched, but when I turn around to look, I see nothing. I go back to work and get a couple more bales broken up and thrown into the spreader before I get that weird feeling again and turn around. About half a football field away, I see the silhouette of a dude at the top of the hill behind me. He turns and walks away after I look at him. I say to myself, okay, that's weird, but it's probably just some kid coming to steal some apples or something and get back to work. For the rest of the bales, I keep looking up and checking around as I keep thinking I'm hearing running footsteps around me, but of course I see nothing when I look up. After I get the rest of the bales into the spreader and kick the residual hay out of the bed, I look up and damn near shit my pants. At the far reach of the truck's high beams, not all that far as it's a mid-90s Ford Ranger, I see this dark figure staring right at me. Immediately this thing feels off, as it's just a little too tall to be human and its limbs look a little too long. After staring at this thing for about a minute, I slowly grab radio and call for my boss or really anyone. No answer. I call again just to be certain I'm not getting reception. No answer. I then quietly get out of the bed and hop into the cab. The literal second my door shuts, this thing snaps around and shoots off away from my headlights. I summon my newfound rally driving skills and shot towards the front of the farm where I could clock out and get home and away from this thing. I've never seen it again, and I sure as hell hope I don't. Used to work night shift at a middle school. Every night while cleaning out the boys' locker room, I would hear at least one locker slam shut, sometimes more. This creeped me out when I started, but after a couple of months I got used to it. One night while cleaning one of the girls' locker room, I heard a girl scream. I walked out of the locker room, even looked outside the building, didn't see anybody. Before that I worked at the high school, I'd randomly hear doors open and close. Nowadays I work day shift at another school. About a year ago I just got to the building to begin my shift. It was still dark out and I was turning on all the lights. When I walked by the main office, I heard what sounded like someone ransacking the place. Papers being tossed. I heard what sounded like a table or file cabinet being dragged. I remember my first thought was, man, somebody must have lost something important. Then I clicked. It was 6 in the morning and it was either Thanksgiving or Christmas break, meaning there was no school and there shouldn't be anybody in there. Took me a second to work up the courage to go in and check it out. When I did, nobody was there and nothing was out of place. Finally, last month I get a call from dispatch at 3 a.m. The fire alarm was going off and they needed somebody to go turn it off. As soon as I walk in, I freak out. The alarm is blaring, but what scared me was the strobe light that flashes with the alarm. The building was pitch black except every other second when that strobe lit the halls up. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie where they're looking for the killer. I was half expecting to see someone pop up out of nowhere when the halls lit up. I worked night security at a museum. I was usually second shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., but I often covered the graveyard shift for some coworkers to get extra money. One night, I'm working a double, 3 p.m. to 7 a.m., and for the second shift, I work all alone. My partner leaves at 11 p.m. and I say goodbye as I'm making coffee. All is quiet and everything is normal. I'm drinking coffee, listening to a podcast, and flipping through Reddit when I see the motion sensors start going off. So I turn on the lights and look at the cameras. The way the motion sensor worked was it told us where the motion was in the building. So I started to follow the motion sensor in conjunction with the cameras, but as the motion is moving, there isn't a damn thing on the cameras. So I start to get worried. I start gathering a flashlight, which doubled as a nightstick, a phone just in case I need to call the authorities, and my cup of coffee. As I'm gathering all of it, something starts banging against the bay door that connects the loading dock, where the security office was, to the rest of the museum. It was like someone threw a hammer at it, but nothing on the playback of the camera. So I go up to the area where the motion sensors were going off, and there wasn't anything. Except the smell. There was a smell like burning hair. It was everywhere I went. So I started worrying about a potential fire, but our fire systems used to get triggered by dust, so they were really sensitive, so I was a little concerned that the system wasn't going off. Then all the hair on my back started standing on end, but nothing was around me. It was freaky, so I ran back to the office and decided to not do the rest of my tours that night, keep the lights on, and monitor the cameras until next shift took over. Not mine, but I used to work in a nursing home which was located in an old building from early 1900s. You'd hear all kind of creaks and mice rattling in the walls etc. when everybody in the house was asleep. The basement where we did all the laundry and housekeeping stuff was something like you'd encounter in Resident Evil 7, especially during night shifts when most of the lights weren't on. There was this specific creepy corridor leading to our laundry room. Everybody hated it even during daytime. My colleague was doing her night shift, and was in the basement doing laundry as we were supposed to ease the workload of other shifts. She took the clothes out of the machine, round the corner and towards the drying room, and didn't bother to turn the lights of the corridor on. First thing she could distinguish in the dark was a man hung from the ceiling a few feet away. Needless to say, she almost had a heart attack, ran upstairs to call her husband and tried to get a hold of her increasing panic. Eventually her husband calmed her down and she was convinced enough to go and turn the lights on for a double check. What she found was a boiler suit and a coat hanger, put up there to dry. There had been some outdoor renovations that day, which was a rainy one. I had huge discomfort going down in the basement during my next night shift. I'm a warehouse security guard in Indiana. I started on midnights and have since moved to seconds. It was around 4 a.m. and I was in the exterior part of my perimeter tour, and since no one was there I was singing a song, just something I like to do while I'm alone. I picked up the habit in scouts when we would go on hikes, so I'm outside. It's maybe 100-foot walk to the door I'm supposed to re-enter the warehouse with. I hear footsteps and an awful voice singing the same song behind me. I whip around and this dude who's basically emaciated, his eyes are bulging, and he's got a bunch of pockmarks on his face is walking behind me. I shit you not, my asshole was so tightly puckered I could have sucked in a bicycle. Some fucking meth or crack addict had snuck up on me and he was less than 15 feet away. I asked him who he was and why he was here. He didn't respond and just kinda watched me. I told him this is private property and it is closed at this time. He needs to leave now or I'm calling the police. He looks around, scratches his arms a bit and turns and walks away, looking back occasionally. He finally left property and when I was absolutely sure he was gone I bolted into the door. Scariest night I've had working there. If he hadn't started singing he could have done whatever he wanted to me. I have tinnitus and sometimes I hear noises that aren't actually there. When I hear footsteps nowadays I typically just chalk it up to I'm hearing a faint echo, because that's what it typically always is. Now whenever I hear anything I look to see what it was. I told my supervisor in the morning that I had to kick a person off property cause they were loitering after hours. Supervisor just kinda told me that stuff like that happens and it's fairly normal this close to the edge of inner Indy. Working alone. I was cleaning carpets at a restaurant at night. 1 second I was cleaning, the next things go black, and then I'm staring at a puddle of blood on the ground. Just on my hands and knees looking at blood. I was confused, and immediately forgot about the blackout and just assumed I'd had a bloody nose. As a carpet cleaner I just turned my machine on and cleaned it up. I went back to cleaning until about 30 minutes and when I got this sense of dread, like I knew I was going to die. I just knew it, and the thing a lot of people don't think about with carpet cleaning is that your hoses are connected to the van, which means you have to leave a door open the entire time. Not only that, but you clean from the furthest point, with your back to that open door. I was positive someone was going to come in and kill me. I finished my job fast enough that the business canceled our contract, actually, because I did a terrible job that night. I finished up, and had to exit out of a door on the opposite side of the restaurant from my van and then circle back around to it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn a lock. I got in my van and took off like a bat out of hell, and then realized almost immediately upon getting on the freeway that someone may have gotten into the back of my van while I was locking up the building. Actually, no, I knew they definitely had, they must have. They were watching me and hopped in while I was locking up the restaurant. Also, for reference, there's a huge-ass vac machine that blocks you from seeing most of the back of the van while driving, and they were definitely hiding behind that. I was positive someone was back there, and I couldn't even look in the rearview mirror the 30-minute drive back to drop off the van at my work because I knew I'd see something. Maybe it wasn't even human, the thing. I didn't know. I jumped in my car, and once I was on the road home I finally felt okay because I had full view of the backseat the entire time. I got home and realized my hair was super crusty. I figured I must have been sweating from the fear and went to wash just my head in the shower. I just wanted to put on a funny show and decompress, so I wasn't going to do a full shower. Blood. Just blood everywhere. In the tub, down my face, splashed onto the wall. Just a river of blood coming off of my head. The rest of the night is a blur, and it took me 2 entire days to realize that I'd gotten a concussion that night and drove for almost an hour in 2 different vehicles immediately afterwards. I now think of that night as the most terrifying night of my life, and honestly for some reason I'm tearing up right now typing this out. There's one thing that will stick with me forever though. I mostly assume I slipped and hit my head on a nearby counter. That makes sense, their tile slope beside the carpet can get pretty slick, and I woke up beside where I remember there being a pretty sharp looking corner. But about 10 minutes before I blacked out, I could have sworn I heard a voice. I could have sworn I heard someone say, distantly, just barely over the sound of my loud-ass vacuum, "Hey, there's someone in there." I just assumed I was hearing things, but I guess I'll never know. 29 years ago I was in training in the US Army at a military medical school. I got guard duty for the school overnight. It was really a joke assignment, just something to make the trainees do. The building was huge but locked, dark and empty, no one was in the building. I had done it a bunch of times and nothing ever happened, so I had no fear. Around 2 a.m. I decided to walk around to stay awake. The building was, I think, 5 floors, and I decided to go the basement first. I'd walk and pretend I was a real security guard. I'd look in corners, keep an ear out for intruders, and pull on some doors every now and then. Tonight one door was open. I decided to go in and make sure no one was in there. It opened into a small rectangular room. I found the lights and turned them on. Not much was in the room but a long rectangular box. I decided to look inside. Perhaps someone was hiding inside? I lifted the lid and saw the body of a middle-aged African-American male lying in formaldehyde, a mesh bag, I later learned most likely contained his organs, on his chest. I freaked. I turned to bolt out of the room, dropping the metal lid, making a loud bang, exacerbating my terror. I grabbed the handle and rushed out the door in one motion, almost breaking my nose because the door had locked behind me. I was trapped in this room with a corpse. After my horror-induced blindness and the stars from the impact subsided, I noticed a door at the opposite end of the room. I couldn't see a light switch at the other side, so I had to turn them off, where I was then move, in the dark, to the other door. I had to walk past the body again, and I did so quickly but very quietly on my toes so I wouldn't disturb the dead. Thankfully the door was unlocked. I passed through and entered the center of a dark, round operating theater. Clearly the man had been dissected that day, and after moving the body to the rectangular room, someone exiting didn't make sure the door had latched behind them. I stumbled around in the dark until I found a door that led to the outside of the theater and back to the main part of the building. I then ran to tell the guy doing guard duty with me what I saw. I worked night shift at a small hotel in a small town in Utah. Every so often, some guy would call us and ask questions about booking a room but would never actually go through with it. One night, he calls in again and I'm entertaining his questions. He asks about rooms and rates, things to do around town, and where we're located. Then he starts asking personal questions like where I'm from, if I'm Mormon, and if I was alone. He then asked if I was standing up, which freaked me out because I was, and I was sure he was somehow watching me. Looking back, it would make sense that I was standing behind the desk on the phone, but my sleep-deprived brain didn't make the connection until later. I told him to stop calling and hung up the phone, then I went to the back room and cried. I called my then boyfriend/now husband, and he talked to me while I calmed down. When I think about it now, it was probably some guy high or drunk and thought it would be funny to mess with someone. It was so freaky, especially since I was alone, tired, and couldn't think straight. Many years ago, I worked at a regional radio station in the middle of fucking nowhere, Australia. I was the overnight operator, keep the overnight playlist running, set up for the morning, do all the manual checks for the next day, and jump on the desk if anything funky happens. I spent a lot of time sitting in what was essentially a tin shed in the middle of a paddock, with my dog, shoes off, listening to 50s and 60s music and doing crossword puzzles. Except one night when the roof shooters came through. They spooked the kangaroos in the paddock, and one of them jumped headfirst through our office window. So there's me, barefoot and half asleep, when this 6-tall kangaroo smashes through the glass window. Blood and glass everywhere. My dog starts chasing the kangaroo, I'm chasing my dog. And the kangaroo bounds around the office, knocking shit off desks in the dark, bleeding everywhere. I ran and opened the studio bay doors, and my dog chased it outside. Where, I'm assuming, the poor thing, the kangaroo, was shot. Then I had to call my boss. I'm a paramedic working graveyard shift. One night, got called for a situation, unknown police on the way. There was a lady around 40 and she just arrived in the country. She was laying on the couch, eyes wide open, pupils fully dilated. There is almost no white in her eye. She's breathing normally but she's not moving. At one point, she screamed and her body jerked in a way that no living thing should move. A friend of her was with her and she was the one who called 911. Trying to figure what happened to the girl and asking basic medical question, her friend told me that she had been exorcised twice in Colombia before. At that point I was scared a little. Since she is not responding at all, we bring her top the hospital. All of her muscle were so hard that when we decided to take her to our stretcher, we were able to carry her like a plank in the stairs. She also tried to scratch my face with her nails, and once every 5 to 10 minutes screamed like something I had never seen before. She went to psych ward after. Never heard from her again. 15 years later I'm still wondering if it was a real demoniac possession or just a psych condition. I used to do night audit at a hotel in a nice part of town. Got a few stories, most nights were tame. Yet this one was pretty memorable. One day at 2 a.m. I hear someone quietly yelling for help. I'm in the back office but have the front desk door slightly open. I go to the front and see a man in his underwear. Just his underwear. He doesn't look homeless or anything but he does look like he's on something. I don't smell weed but he's clearly on something. He seems extremely frazzled. Jittery. Like he just saw a ghost. There's a lady in my room, he tells me. She pushed me out of the room. She's not supposed to be there. He continues. Clearly shook. I ask for his name to look up what room he's in. And also to verify if he's even a guest. Sure enough, he is a guest in the hotel. And sure enough, the room was only authorized for him and nobody else. I asked him to explain further, to tell me what he saw. But he just kept repeating about how he went to use the bathroom in his room and when he came out a woman appeared in his room and pushed him out. She wasn't anybody he knew and he was on a business trip. So he was alone. A part of me is shook but also super excited since nothing interesting happens. I grab the master key. We go up the elevator. We go to the 3rd floor. We walk down the hallway. His room was close to the end of the hall. My heart pounding with each step we get closer. I unlock the door. I walk towards the bathroom. I look around. It's a small room. The room is clearly empty. Nobody is inside it. The guy seems shook. Asked to review the cameras. I tell him I don't have access to that, I just do the paperwork. But I'll leave a note in the morning for my supervisor to review. The guy is clearly shook. Again, he's in his underwear. I give him free breakfast. And tell him that I assure you we'll get to the bottom of it. But yeah, that night was pretty spooky. First of all, just want to say I'm loving all the stories on this thread and I don't usually have anything to share, but I remember this incident and thought some of you might be interested. I'm not good storyteller, so bear with me. I used to work the night shift at a grocery store in my small town in North Dakota and we usually closed at 10 p.m. but sometimes people would come in last minute. It was annoying, but the store director didn't want us to tell customers to leave, but before we locked up I usually did a walkthrough of the store to make sure no one was in it so we could pull the registers. This one incident seriously creeped me and another courtesy out. So I was doing my usual walk around before closing. We had skeleton crew that night and I see this priest, really tall guy, bald. I walked past him and said hi, he smiled. I walked all the way back around and the other courtesy tells me he saw the priest too, and the cashier asks me if it's okay to pull the drawer and I say there's one more person in the store. I tell her it's a priest. She says he never came and I thought maybe she wasn't paying attention to the doors and didn't see him, so we wait for him to check out and the manager asks if anyone is in the store. It's been around like 10 minutes since I checked, so I go around again and I can't find him, so I go again cause I thought I might have missed him and I still can't find him, so I check the bathrooms and Ziggy, the other courtesy, goes around with me and we check the employee bathrooms. He looked pretty old so he might have gotten lost. We even the back storeroom and we can't find him. Am I pretty convinced I saw a ghost or something that night cause the other bagger was up front and I'm pretty sure the cashier would have remembered checking out a priest. He was pretty spooked too. I'm pretty sure the cashier and my Manager didn't believe us. What do you guys think it was? Not working, but studying by night. Something fucking creepy happened once. So at the time, I was living at my dad's place, medium normal house, and he had a pretty nice shed in the backyard. This particular winter, I decided to rearrange the shed so I would have a place to chill out, smoke protected from the cold. The shed became a classic chilling spot, and me and my neighbor started to really upgrade it, hooking up electricity, some lights and even a little TV and Xbox. One weekend, I was alone and decided to study in there with music and all, not bothered by anyone. Completely lost track of time, and went on to study until 2 to 3 in the morning. Since the shed was completely sealed off, I never noticed a sun setting. When I saw how late it was, I started to gather my stuff to go back in the home and sleep, but then out of nowhere I hear 3 fucking loud knocks on the door. I was literally paralyzed in fear, eyes locked on the doorknob. The very same weekend, my neighbor and I created an inside with lock since the door wouldn't shut properly and let the cold in. So I look at this with lock, and I can see the doorknob wiggling a bit. First thing I think is it's mostly my neighbor, but why isn't he saying anything, and mostly why is he there at 2 to 3 in the morning? So I wait a few minutes, called out his name, no answer, no nothing. It took me about 15 minutes to gather the courage to pop open the door. There was no one, and a little snow matted the whole backyard, with absolutely no footprints leading up to the door of the shed. The next day I closed the whole thing and never chilled in there again. I was absolutely petrified. Fresh out of college with a degree in psychology, I obviously end up working at a psych hospital to start gaining experience in the field. I was able to work on quite a few units, some were great, some were really rough. I worked overnights for a few years, and there were plenty of things that either happened or things I heard from patients that would easily scare someone who comes from outside those walls. I am also a huge horror fan, so it takes a lot to rattle me. Why this stuck out to me the most, but it shook me during a night shift. This woman, who was quite young, ended up having a complete mental breakdown from all the stress going on in her life. Being somewhat local to this hospital, I ended up knowing a lot more people than I expected. Although I didn't know her personally, her father was a teacher at my high school, and things like that just hit harder when it is someone from your community. I've handled a lot of patients, and most of them either had family history of psych problems or have abused drugs for years. All of it is sad in my eyes, but she was completely normal until her break and was in complete psychosis. For some reason that also hit me harder. So the unit is just one long hallway, as I'm sure you can imagine. The nurses' station is directly in the middle, where our cafeteria, aka essentially just a room with tables and water, was right across the hall from us. Then that lead to our fenced-in courtyard, but all doors are magnetically locked. Then the right of the station is all of the administration office, and to the left are all of the patients' rooms. We normally keep all doors closed and locked. So one night this woman couldn't sleep and was up quite often. No big deal, she would maybe pace a little bit, would go back in her room after a little, and didn't disturb anyone. She kept asking for water, so it was a lot of getting up to unlock the door to get into the cafeteria that I eventually just kept it unlocked, because between her and some other patients it was just annoying to keep getting up. Again, and the door to the courtyard is this giant metal door with a giant magnetic lock, and me and the 2 nurses are right there. So she grabs some water and is hanging out. She starts staring at the door, but this isn't unusual for her, she goes into the episodes a lot. Then all of a sudden she fucking busts through the door and just started sprinting towards the opposite fence. Now look, I'm not saying these doors are indestructible or can't be broken open. I've seen large patients do it when they are full on angry and have a running start. She was maybe 140 pounds and was a few steps in front of it with no running start. It was insane. I was in shock. Like, there should be no way a girl her size with that little momentum can do that. And it like busted open, and again she took off. Besides almost throwing up from instantly thinking about the amount of shit I'm going to be in if this girl hops the fence. I'm getting up sprinting after her. I moved quick, but it didn't matter because she just stopped dead in her tracks and was staring into the dark night. I asked her what the hell is she doing, and all she said was, "Sorry, I wanted to go outside," in this creepy calm voice after she somehow hulked this freaking door open. "Nope, not doing this, get your ass back inside." Zero problem, she apologizes and walks inside and goes to bed. I'm all jacked up, nurses are like WTFIDK. A few hours later she wants water in that same locked room. Okay NBD, but now I have to be in there just in case. She's pleasant, starts staring out the window, and there is a light post with a round light on top in the next courtyard over. She goes, "Whoa, look at that balloon." I obviously know she isn't in the right mind, so I try explaining to her it's a light, and we kind of jokingly go back and forth. She is smiling and laughing about it. Then mid-freaking sentence her face goes completely blank. And she slowly turns to me and gives me the Father, Son, Holy Spirit motion like she is freaking blessing me, and I freak the hell out. I've seen enough horror movies to know this isn't a damn good sign. Instantly sent her back to her room. Her blank face staring at me blessing me still freaks me out to this day. Why? Like she somehow saw my future and was telling me something bad was about to happen. There were much worse things I've witnessed over time, but from a night shift perspective that rocked me. I worked the closing shift at a pizza place one night. My friend, we'll call him Jake, was in the office counting up the money from the day and I was out in the lobby turning everything off. As I was walking towards the back to help Jake, I swear to God I saw someone standing in our arcade room staring right at me. I was definitely freaked out as we had been closed for 20 minutes and the front door was locked, so there was no way anyone could have gotten in. As I went to go talk to the person to ask them to leave, Jake came running to the front and he quickly pulled me into the back office. I told him the situation and he told me to look at the cameras. Nothing. No one had been in that room for at least half an hour. He then went on to explain the story of what happened in there. About 5 years prior to that night, a mentally ill man had gone off his meds and ended up shooting himself inside that room. A lot of weird shit happens on the night shift, such as things moving on their own or people hearing their name being called when no one is around. I hadn't experienced any of that until that night, then afterwards, even on the day shift, I'd sometimes hear my name being called. Many years ago I briefly had a job that started at 3:30 a.m. The job itself was very boring, but the commute was wild. The world is at its weirdest in the very early morning. Road hazards haven't been called in yet, so one day I pulled off the freeway and discovered that the off-ramp was completely flooded, deep enough that I have no idea how my car didn't stall. But the most interesting discovery was that if law enforcement has to raid a home, they do it around 3 or 4 in the morning because that's the best chance of everyone being peacefully asleep. One day I was nearly to work when I noticed something off ahead of me. I slowed down and came up to a massive police blockade, squad cars everywhere and absolutely crawling with heavily armed officers. But all in absolute silence. They silently waved me down a side street. Just a creepy, unsettling experience. Worked night shift at a large grocery store, one that wasn't open overnight but had a skeleton crew to work the loads and do prep and clean. I worked near the entrance, large glass doors but visually blocked off from my vantage point. Around 3 a.m., I hear knocking on the doors. This isn't completely uncalled for, usually it's someone coming in for an early shift but didn't have a key card, sometimes it's someone's food delivery, or sometimes a customer who thinks we are open despite clearly being closed. I approach the door, it's a man that I don't recognize, wet from the rain. He looks normal enough, but something about him unnerved me. He had that vibe to him, you know, the one where it seems like maybe they're on their way to becoming a full-blown meth head, but for now they still manage to give the appearance of functionality. He was holding his shit together just enough to appear normal, but the edges were definitely shaky. Anyway, without unlocking the door, I announced that the store was closed. He told me that he just needed my help, his car had broken down in the parking lot and he needed a boost. I didn't drive, so I told him I couldn't help him. I should have walked away there, but he was out in the rain and I did legitimately feel bad, so I told him I would see if anyone of our few crew did drive. I did find someone who was willing to help, and got the night crew manager involved as well. We went out, turns out he was parked a bit off from the entrance, in a fairly secluded spot, and he had a lady with him. There was a similar vibe with her, almost but not exactly normal. It didn't click right away, but I figured they had been hooking up in the car in the parking lot, maybe left the radio or lights on and drained the battery. To me, that explained the weird unnerving feeling. They either felt ashamed, or guilty, and it was showing through. Anyway, my coworker goes over to help give them a boost. The manager and I stay out there with him, nearby, watching. The two lovebirds kept peeking over at us a bit uncomfortably. After a few moments, the coworker returns from the car, and hurries us back inside. We don't see them drive off, which seems odd. We get inside, lock up again, and then the coworker thanks us for staying out there with him, and not leaving him alone with them. He also caught on to the unnerving air about them, and it made him worried. What worried him more, was when it also turned out that there was nothing wrong with their car. I worked at a movie theater when I was 17 and had a couple of things happen that were corroborated years later by current employees. After the last showing of the night, my manager would lock the doors and the rest of the crew would do a final sweep/cleanup of the theater and bathrooms. On more than one occasion and between 3 of my female coworkers, they heard the sound of a child laughing in the ladies' room. Every time it happened the manager would have to check the bathroom, but no one was ever in there. One of those women quit after it happened to her a second time. Another time, a customer came running toward the concession stand from one of the theaters at the end of the hall, screaming. To this day it's as scared as I've ever seen anyone. She kept saying it's bleeding, It's bleeding over and over. Once we calmed her down enough to get a full sentence out of her, she said there was an arm hanging out of the wall of the theater she was in and it was dripping blood. Naturally, my boss called the police and they investigated it. There was no arm hanging out of the wall, but one of the officers did find a square hole in the concrete behind the padded wall. It was deep enough to reach his arm into it up to his shoulder. The only thing that I was part of that still creeps me out was the man in the protection room. We used the emergency door in one of the theaters to take the trash out because the dumpster was just outside of it. When you brought the rolly bins back in, you could see up into the projection room. Well, on more than one occasion myself and a few of the guys would see a man standing in the window of the projection room looking down at us. He was wearing a brimmed hat, similar to what you see in old detective movies, a trilby I think it's called, so you couldn't quite see all of his face. One night I was bringing the bins back in and the man was looking down at me and I saw the glare of red eyes. Sort of like the eye shine of a cat. When I told my manager, he turned white as a sheet and asked me not to talk about it or tell anyone. I quit the next day. Since then I've been to that movie theater a few times and spoken to employees about whether they've seen anything strange, and enough of them have, at least for me to believe something is going on there. I worked in an open quarry mine down in Texas. We had this storm where it rained like a motherfucker for hours and hours. Being night shift, 6:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., supervisor, I was in charge of 8 Cat 745 haul trucks, 2 Cat 390 excavators, 6 Cat 980 loaders, 2 D8 dozers, and 1 D9 dozer. It was about 2 a.m. when I had 3 haul trucks get stuck in the bottom of the mine, just spinning their tires endlessly. It was horrible. Since we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars of production per shift, I had to get permission to shut the mine down from the superintendent and relay that to the supervisors up in the plant that washes/dries the material, frac sand. They wouldn't shut down because I said so. I called him at minimum 13 times within an hour to get him to shut the mine down. Since it was 2 a.m., he never answered, which never happened as he always had his phone on. 3 to 4 of us were soaking wet and covered from head to toe in mud to the point where you couldn't even tell we were wearing neon green high-vis safety gear. We got the trucks pulled out of the mine after roughly 3 hours of using a combo of the dozers and loaders and excavators to essentially build a new road from drier materials. The superintendent got in at 6 a.m. for the 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. shift, took one look at the mine, and shut it down for the day. Turns out his phone charger came unplugged and his phone died in the middle of the night. Never knew I called. I work at a hotel in the middle of city and I was on the overnight front desk shift when me and my valet at the time realized there was a man in one of the guest rooms that was prior occupied. We called the police and found that the guests upstairs hogtied him, so he was escorted out. Nothing too crazy. Stuff like that happens all the time in a hotel like this. But we had the 3 lowest floors of the hotel shut down due to low occupancy during COVID-19. We soon discovered he was caught in the guest room after trying to open every door from the floor up, seeing if it was unlocked or propped open slightly. He was staying in one of our vacant rooms on the low floor unknown to us, for a week, stealing food from the minibar and banquet halls. We watched him on the security cameras on the lower floors walking around the halls every night butt naked and videoing himself. Security officer here, posted one night to an old site that apparently was a hospital being turned into a rest home. With no power on site, all I had was my flashlight and laptop to watch movies cause it was a 12-hour watch. Place was massive, and at night you literally can't see fuck all. Anyways, the company had put up a temporary security camera that every time it picks up motion, thing sends of a loud siren sound for about 30 seconds. First time that thing went off I went to investigate with emergency service on speed dial and goosebumps flaring. I wouldn't seem to find what was causing it to go off. It then would go off a couple more times into the night. It got to the point where I would just let it do its thing. But every time it went off it would send shivers down my spine. When we do our handover with the next guard I would tell him all the time how the siren just goes off at night all the time. I haven't been back in a while. But man, I still think about that place till this day. It scares me. I worked third shift as RN on orthopedic floor. Never failed, every full moon crazy things happen. One night we each had 11 patients and 3 nurses, no CNA. It started with the man who was on oxygen constantly trying to smoke in his room despite hearing the dangers and warnings. Before I could contact shift manager, I hear a noise I can't describe. One of my coworkers' patients with a rectal tube in, had slid out of his special air mattress onto the floor with the rectal tube out. As she and I are trying to get him back in bed, the phone is ringing. Get him in bed with help of strong security guards help. Answer the phone and one of my patients kept calling 911. She was receiving too much pain medication. When I walked in to check on her, She had climbed, post-opus 2 knee replacements, over the side rail and was all tangled up. That wasn't even the whole shift. Gunshot victim with angry family around past visiting hours, literally got yanked by one patient's family member into a room and shoved towards a guy who they say is going to vomit. Of course, before I could grab a bucket, it went all over me. Many mornings I went home with vomit, urine had a full urinal thrown at me, or worse somewhere on my person. Always disrobed on mud porch and immediately showered every morning. Between all of those calamities there were strokes, codes, and DNR patients who pass away even on orthopedic. There is a lot entailed in preparing the deceased patient for family to say final goodbyes, then much more after the family's departure. Not sure why this particular memory is so prevalent in my mind, as there were much worse incidents that happened. In my 20s, I used to deep clean a Burger King between 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. while it was closed. After my shift, I'd either head north and stop at Circle K on my way to another job, or head west to an Exxon to grab a cup of coffee to help keep me up so I could regulate my schedule. I'll call the clerk working at the Circle K, Alice. Alice was in her early 20s, very pleasant, and knew I was a regular at 4 a.m. She'd put down whatever she was doing and take a smoke break with me. Our conversations were mostly about movies and TV, occasionally crazy night shift stories, but rarely personal. It was a nice break after being alone all night. Now on days that I didn't go to my other job, I'd head to Exxon on my way home, where the clerk, whom I'll call Bob, would also stop what he was doing and join me for an early morning smoke. Bob was in his mid-20s, and we would talk mostly about sports and music. Now and then his buddies would be there as well. It passed the time before the sun would rise and people would be out and about. One night, I finished my Burger King job early and headed to the Circle K to chit-chat with Alice before my other job. As I was coming up to her gas station, I saw the parking lot roped off in yellow tape and several police cars in the lot. My heart sank as I headed to work. Later on that morning, I heard it on the news. It was awful. Alice had been murdered. She was shot in the back of her head. The murderer emptied the register and took the surveillance tapes that were recording at that time and left her in the back office. Police had no leads. After my shift that following night, I headed over to Exxon before going home. Bob asked me if I heard the news about the Circle K clerk. We were both in shock that something like that took place in our sleepy, southern town. We discussed how we'd deal with an intruder if our stores were attacked. It makes you take a step back and realize how quick it can all end. The Circle K was up and running a day after the murder. Things were starting to become complacent again in a short manner of time. For a couple of weeks, there were no leads. I'm sure I was recorded on earlier surveillance tapes, so I was waiting to get called, but never did. Even though I stopped going to Circle K, I'd still visit Bob at Exxon and we'd carry on as usual. About a month later, the news reported that they had found the murderer. They had a shot of 3 guys in handcuffs against the back of the police cruiser. One by one, they showed their faces. The first one looked familiar, but couldn't recognize him. The second one appeared and I couldn't place him either. That's when I saw the third guy. My jaw dropped. How could it be? And there he was on my TV screen. Bob. All this time had passed and I was alone with this guy discussing this murder for weeks and then did it. Man, I was duped. Bob confessed to the police. It turns out that Bob and Alice had been dating when she called it off because he didn't give her space. On his days off, he'd sit in the Circle K parking lot watching her, and if he was working, one of his buddies did it for him. As I suspected, I wasn't the only one she'd have a smoke break with. There were other customers who enjoyed chatting with her. Bob lost it one night after one of these smoke breaks and killed her. His buddies were the watchouts. He got caught by showing off the recordings of the surveillance camera and telling people that he made a movie and how realistic the murder looked. In the end, they all had their day in court, the details revealed, and each of them went to prison. Bob was placed on death row and was eventually executed. I was an assistant front office manager at a luxury boutique property known for its weddings. I always worked the evening shift, roughly 2 to 11 p.m. One weekend we had 3 weddings and an overnight call off. I was off the next day and offered to cover the whole shift, while the manager offered to come in at 3 a.m. After some negotiations we agreed he would come in at 5 a.m. Since the overnight crew worked in pairs, one at the front and one in the back of working phones, they typically took turns on who took what spot. On nights I had to cover, however, the rule was I worked the phones, which was easier, and had a chair. I had come in at noon that day and was just massacred, feeling every second of the overnight and counting to 5 a.m. 5 a.m. on the dot, and the MMOT has not arrived when I get a frantic phone call that his partner was unresponsive. We do a lot of training for this sort of thing, and with an adrenaline rush it takes over. I'm on the phone with 911 as I am radioing security to go up to the room. I call the phone tree of emergency response for the hotel as I am running to valet to have the drive cleared. Mod walks in then and we are able to coordinate to get room for the ambulances and get EMS to the room. Now I had called paramedics before, but this was the first really serious call. Over a dozen emergency personnel came with like 4 different vehicles. I'm at the desk directing the ones that come in and briefing the GM and director of rooms as they arrive in cargo shorts looking rumpled. The poor security guard who had been giving CPR came down and was shaking like a leaf. He knew it. We all knew it. The guy wasn't going to make it. They wheel him out, still alive but barely. His partner and his mother are in the lobby just absolutely frantic. I make sure valet gets their vehicle so they can follow the ambulance. He was with a wedding that was being held that night, so the GM arranged a hospitality room with breakfast for the family to gather. At this point, 6:30 a.m., the uncle of the bride of a different wedding calls demanding a room ready by noon because he is super important. We were sold out that night and checkout was noon, so I go on my first come first serve script and he just goes off. I remember staring at the phone clutched in my hand. I'm in a vice grip as I struggled not to bang it on the desk. I summoned my customer service voice and asked him to hold before giving the call to the mod. The only time in my career I just refused to even try and help someone. I just couldn't. Not that morning. 2 hours after it starts, the director of rooms pulls us into his office for a debrief, what to say or not to say, just game plan for the fallout, and not realizing I had just worked 19 hours straight tells me to go take a lap to clear my head. Thankfully another manager tells him I'm off and I get sent home. I went to my car and just freaking cried. Worst shift of my life.